Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 77. If you hear the occasional patter of heavy falling water in the background, I do apologise, but it is England and we're currently experiencing some form of heavy storm, and so it's raining a little bit heavier than normal. Since this is the channel admin section, and as per last week, I thought I'd take the chance to just issue a couple of minor corrections. Firstly, in the PT boat video, when I described the PT boats Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 as using Lewis guns, I stated they were using .303 caliber Lewis guns. As a number of you pointed out, and after a bit more digging, this is not entirely accurate. They were in fact using Lewis guns, and yes, the Lewis gun did come in .303. However, the particular Lewis guns they were using were actually chambered in .30-06, which is a fractionally different US-based caliber. The reason I chose .303 when I was making the original video was basically because when I was doing my research, the caliber of Lewis guns in both British and American service was described variously as .303, .30-06, 7.62mm, 30 caliber, and a number of other esoteric measurements. Plus, what doesn't help is that although primarily the British use .303 and primarily the Americans use .30-06, the British also use .30-06 with some American-made Lewis guns, and the particular M1917 pattern Lewis gun that the PT boats were using was manufactured by Savage, the wonderfully named manufacturer of Lewis guns in the US, in both .303 and .30-06. Although primarily in .30-06 after World War I, which was all very confusing, and since at the time I didn't have a definitive answer, just multiple answers, which basically boiled down to, yeah, it's an M1917 Lewis gun, but could be chambered in either one, I went with .303 because, well, 50-50. As it turns out, it was the wrong 50, so, oh well, never mind, now you know. And of course, again, as a number of you pointed out, my good old nemesis, the difference between the Black and Baltic Seas, reared its head. At this rate, I'm going to have to make a t-shirt to remind myself of the difference between those two. As previously, I blame my reading of the Crimean War, because of course the Crimean War mainly takes place in the Black Sea, but the last bit of extensive reading I did on the Crimean War was about the lesser-known Baltic campaign, so now I am perpetually confused between the two. Oh well, better not go to those areas, otherwise I will get in trouble. So this week's questions are taken from the videos on Mers-El-Kebir and the Kamchatka. Those were two particularly fun videos, so let's get on with those, starting with The Lost Beaver asking, how exactly does one accidentally signal that they're under attack? Well, there are two ways of doing it. First, you can accidentally signal that you're under attack in terms of falsely believing that you are under attack and thus signalling this in good faith to the rest of the fleet. And this can be done at the time of the Kamchatka, which unsurprisingly this question is from that video, by a number of methods, bearing in mind that the radio was very much in its infancy, so probably not really going to be used, but you could do it by lamp, as shown in the picture above, or by signal flags. And with the signal flags, you could spell it out from the standard international code book, or you might use a specific signal that has been prearranged for that particular exercise or fleet maneuver by the admiral in charge, and this was quite often done in the era when flag maneuvers were quite critical. Certain combinations, which might not necessarily mean anything particular under standard coding, would be assigned specific meaning by the admiral, and then the rest of the ships would know, right, if a ship hoists this particular signal, it means this for the purposes of this particular voyage. And if you absolutely had to get somebody's attention very quickly, you could also fire a gun, not at the person you were trying to get the attention of, albeit that probably would get their attention very fast, but you would fire a gun as a warning and a kind of look over here, because then if someone hears gunfire, they're probably going to look in that direction to see what's going on and then see your lamp signal or flag signal as appropriate. In terms of accidentally signalling that you're under attack unintentionally, see sort of the previous thing with the flags. If you make the wrong flag signal somehow, if you get confused or mixed up and you accidentally hoist that and you mean something completely different, then basically a screw up in your flag signaling could end up with you giving the wrong instruction. And potentially if you're signaling by lamp, given that again certain key phrases might be condensed into 2 or 3 letters by an admiral in his instructions for easier transmission of critical data, you might also then accidentally flash the wrong signal to somebody. So it could be done accidentally when you think you're actually under attack, and accidentally, completely unintentionally, when you know you're not under attack. And given the period of the Kamchatka's existence, those are the 2 main ways that could occur. Santiago Trujillo Tobon asks, did the gunner in HMS Malaya get to eat his birthday cake after all was settled and done? Funnily enough, although this is directly related to the whole situation surrounding Mers-El-Kebir, this question actually came in the Kamchatka video, but nevertheless, the gunner on HMS Malaya that I mentioned in the Kamchatka video, who was in Alexandria at the time and was looking down his gun barrels at a ship that had not too many hours before offered him to have him over for his own birthday celebration. As far as I can tell, history doesn't record if he actually got to consume said confection, albeit that the eventual climb down and negotiated settlement in Alexandria was done relatively amicably, with obviously a sudden big spike in tension once word of what happened in Mers-El-Kebir got through to them. But one would hope that, given that the situation was properly de-escalated, that even if it was belated, maybe he did get his cake. At some point I will see if I can look into it further and see if he ever did give an interview where he talked about the eventual fate of said cake, but it would be nice to think that they were able to enjoy it. Tim Keys asks, he'd like to hear if there's any explanation as to why seemingly the whole crew of Kamchatka was not only incompetent but also immune to learning, and what actually happened on board to cause all the trouble. It was a whole host of things, really. No one can ever be 100% certain, because most of Kamchatka's crew went to the bottom with her. And to be perfectly honest, I suspect most of the ones that survived weren't particularly willing to talk about it. But we do know there were some broad-ranging issues within the Imperial Russian fleet at the time. Part of it, which was Russia as a whole, was not a happy place. There had been a number of attempted revolutions and rebellions, albeit that obviously the big famous Russian Revolution in the late 1910s hadn't happened yet. There had, however, already been a number of revolts, both along Marxist lines and others, and there was quite a lot of simmering discontent generally. Beyond that was the fact that within the Navy itself, quite a lot of the crew were conscripts. That wasn't the case, strictly speaking, across the entire Russian fleet, but in a lot of places there were a lot of conscript crew. Depending on the ship, they could be treated reasonably or terribly or anything in between. And it's entirely possible that aboard Kamchatka it was more towards the terrible end of things. With the aforementioned sort of failed revolutions and stuff, there were often, much as the word conspiracy has been somewhat maligned in the more recent past by association with conspiracy theories, but there were literal conspiracies aboard, especially of the Marxist bent, which often led to various inefficiencies, shall we say, amongst various ships' crews. Plus, there was the fact that, simply put, a lot of the kind of second and third line Russian units, which to be honest, was what made up most of the Second Pacific Fleet and the follow-on ships, were very much grabbed out of wherever in Russia and then brought forward and given a degree of training and then stuck on a ship. And bearing in mind that Kamchatka was not even a full-on warship, it wouldn't have exactly got the first pick of those. When you read into it in a bit more detail, you do wonder how some of these ships even managed to stay upright, considering that some of the crew, albeit this is the extreme case, not the general case, but some of the crew were apparently so completely new to the ideas of high technology and the sea existing, because they had previously literally been serf farmers in the heartlands of Russia, which are not notable for their coastlines, then just been picked up, told, right, you are serving the Tsar now, and we're going to take you off to serve in the Navy. And their first question probably would have been, what is a Navy? Oh, it's a bunch of ships that are at sea. Okay, what are ships and what is sea? And basically having then been given a crash course on it. This is the sea, at which point them going, I have never seen such a large body of water in my life and this terrifies me. They were then put on a small metal box in the middle of said body of water, and some of the crew, again, very small minority, but some of them are recorded as basically staying inside their ship until the ship got back into port, because they absolutely refused to have anything to do with being in visual proximity to the ocean. They were that scared of it. Well, to be fair, given the fate of the Russian fleet at Tsushima, they weren't necessarily wrong, but yeah, to say crew quality was low would be an understatement. So between poorly educated and trained crews in some cases, possible poor discipline, the fact that the captain appears to have either been paranoid or one of these sort of semi-rebellious conspirators, and the possibility that the crew were likewise, or just badly disciplined, effectively adds up to the most likely scenario that explains quite how badly the Kamchatka performed. Intercity 125125 asks, when did the Royal Navy actually become the Royal Navy? Well, that's an odd question for a talking train, but nevertheless. Effectively, you can trace the Royal Navy back to two possible main origin points, depending on exactly how you want to make the definition. Handily, this picture of the Battle of Sluis is not actually relevant to either of them. It pretty much sits bang in the middle of the 2 points, but I thought it's a fun way of showing ancient shipping, so there you go. The earlier point is King Alfred, as he was, as far as we can tell, pretty much the first English king to get around to the act of organising a actual force of warships built, funded and paid for by the state. Well, the state, at least in as much as the king's household. And that was to help combat Viking raids, which, amongst other things, would contribute towards him being known as Alfred the Great by later historians. However, they were very much the personal property of the king, and the navy, if you want to call it such, or the fleet, waxed and waned over the next few centuries, as with these ships basically, as we said, being the personal property of the king, they weren't a kind of a standing fleet. They would be bought and ordered and then potentially sold or lost, and they weren't even necessarily always warships, bearing in mind that actually the vast majority of warships, at least in the Atlantic and Northern Sea waters, were pretty much interchangeable with merchant ships unless and until you were actually going into combat, because a merchant ship and a warship, let's say, if we're talking about medieval times, say a cog, or in the Anglo-Saxon and Norman period, something like a longship, they're literally able to be used for either occupation. Now, fair enough, there were mercantile versions of longships which were somewhat more suited to the task, but that didn't prevent you using a more warlike longship for trade purposes. It's just less efficient at it, and a cog is a cog is a cog. effectively the difference between a war longship, apart from a few design choices, and a merchant longship was that if you built it with a more warlike specification, if it was filled with angry men with axes, swords, and shields, then it was a warship, and if it was filled with slightly less angry men who might also possess axes, swords, and shields, but were not necessarily in the business of bashing your head in completely unprovoked, but instead had brought some handy trade goods, it was a trade ship. And similarly enough with cogs, basically about the only thing you do to a cog to turn it into a warship would be to build a few of these forecastles and aftercastles on it, or given the number of pirates that were around at the time, perhaps, shall we say, strengthen and enlarge those forecastles and aftercastles and stick a bunch of troops on it. And that basically was a medieval warship. If you were feeling particularly adventurous, you could try putting some kind of catapult on it, but that wasn't very common. So going through that whole Anglo-Saxon Norman medieval period, you could argue as to whether or not this actually constitutes a true Royal Navy, because at times there weren't any royal ships that were suitable for war service, because, well, when they're privately owned, they tend to be rather expensive to maintain, and the king has lots of other things to do. Now, that brings us to the second date, which is around the time of Henry VIII, because at the time of Henry VIII, in the sort of the Tudor period and then developing on under the reign, particularly of his daughter Elizabeth I, this is when you start to see both warships beginning to delineate themselves much more clearly from merchant ships. The delineation had started way back when cannon had first become prevalent as ship-to-ship weapons, but the delineation really became clear during the period that in England at least is known as the Tudor period, coupled with the, should we say, rather large influx of wealth that Henry VIII had managed to gain from effectively saying, I'm the head of the church now, and that means that all your belongings are my belongings, and the church at the time had a lot of belongings, so thanks very much for all the cash. Henry managed to start building what was then known as the Navy Royal. This is the same kind of English grammar that leads to the Ark Royal instead of the Royal Ark, but there you go. And this is really where you start to see dedicated warships owned by the king for the purpose of state strategic objectives, maintained constantly from then on, flying both the royal personal and the English at the time standards, later on obviously British, and with their own system of maintenance, dockyards, forts, upkeep, ship design, etc., etc. So, as a unbroken chain of organised warships, you're probably looking at some point around Henry VIII or Elizabeth I's reign to establish the Royal Navy as a dedicated organisation. So there's your two choices, at least as far as I'm aware. If anyone else has any other ideas, feel free to chime in, but I think those are probably arguably the two most solid claims. Dat Good asks, how advanced were the Japanese with regards to radar compared to Germany? The answer is that the Japanese were actually quite considerably behind the Germans. So, for reference, the Germans were experimenting with what we might call some prototype sets that were returning decent results in 1935, and then the first operational radar sets that they took to sea were from the period of late 1937. Whether that was deployed on the Deutschland or the Graf Spee remains something of a matter of debate, as both ships have claimed to be the first at various points. And various improved sets were being deployed across the German fleet from about 1939 onwards, although the Germans would fall behind somewhat in the race for centimetric radar. They would nevertheless continue to develop their radar at a relatively decent pace, and would have fairly sophisticated radar suites by the end of the war. Now, comparative to that, the Japanese fleet, on the other hand, well, they only really started to deploy their first radar in 1941, which is, as simple math will tell you, about 4 years after the Germans, but considerably also behind the Americans and the British. And this set was not particularly that technologically advanced, to say the least. The slightly odd thing is that this wasn't actually down to any lack of scientific development on Japan's part. In fact, they had quite a number of very intelligent researchers and scientists who came up with a number of advances during the 1930s, some of which were adopted by the other powers. And in fact, going back even into the 1920s, certain papers written by Japanese scientists were used in the development of other nations' radars. But the Japanese themselves, for a combination of potentially not actually recognizing its utility, but also just flat out the internal competition between the various Japanese armed forces, meant they didn't actually pursue it all that much relative to the other nations. I mean, to give some idea of the difference in circumstance, as we said, Germany was fractionally behind Britain and America, although not tremendously. But even late in the war, when you go to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, you have a situation where during the attack on Taffy 3, practically any US ship that relies on guns in any major way, shape or form has radar-directed fire control, down to things like USS Johnston, which is of course a destroyer, whereas on the Japanese side, only Yamato herself has any kind of fire control radar system, and it's nowhere near comparable to the ones that are equipped on the US ships. Next, we have Will Actually asking, the Laconia incident, were the Allies right or wrong? So, for those of you unfamiliar with the situation, the Laconia, or RMS Laconia, was an ocean liner that had been converted into a troop ship, and in that role she was being used to move mostly Italian prisoners of war, along with some civilians and some soldiers who were mostly guarding the prisoners. She was attacked by a German submarine, the U-156, which was legitimate because, well, she was a troop ship. Laconia was hit and was going down. U-146 surfaced to capture some senior officers to see if they'd have any valuable intelligence, and realised to their horror that there were several thousand struggling prisoners of war and civilians, along with some soldiers and seamen in the water. U-156 then, in a display of genuine humanity, which has to be absolutely commended, began rescue operations and signalled Kriegsmarine High Command asking for instructions given the humanitarian disaster that was going on. Now, at this point, the Germans continued to demonstrate significant humanity. So Admiral Dönitz immediately pulled multiple U-boats away from wolf packs and sent them to try and help the situation. Now, at this point, having issued those orders, Dönitz informed Admiral Raeder, the head of the Kriegsmarine, to what was going on, and then Raeder ordered some of the U-boats to disengage, but did order some other U-boats to proceed. So you might think this is a little bit harsh, but at the same time, Raeder did ask the Vichy French to send ships from their nearby colonies to help collect survivors, which the Vichy French actually did. They sent out a cruiser and a couple of smaller ships. Raeder also informed Hitler. Hitler, in a move that may come as little surprise to people, actually ordered that the rescue be cancelled, but both Raeder and Dönitz basically tacitly ignored him and continued with their efforts as we've just described. So a relatively major rescue operation was underway, with signals being sent in the clear in English, basically saying, this is what we're doing, these are the survivors, can anyone please come and help, even so much as to go to say that the German ships wouldn't attack any Allied ships that came to help. Now, the British who received those signals thought it might be a sort of a ruse or a decoy, which, to be fair, you can potentially understand their reasoning for that, but they did realise that the ship had been torpedoed and did dispatch ships to pick up survivors, regardless of whether or not they believe the Germans. So far, this is all sounding like a fairly positive story. Unfortunately, this is where it takes something of a darker turn, because a B-24 Liberator, flown by the US Army Air Force, spotted one of the submarines with survivors aboard, literally aboard, as in on the back of the submarine, plus boats being towed, as well as receiving multiple signals from the submarine, basically telling them what they're doing, with the submarine displaying a Red Cross flag. This is where it gets very dark, and this is when my blood pressure starts to spike, because the captain of the pilot of the bomber chose not to respond and instead radioed back to base. The base commander, being informed directly of what the bomber was observing, and bear in mind this is a submarine flying the Red Cross with hundreds of survivors on its back and towing other lifeboats, so clearly not a ruse, ordered the Liberator to attack. And then the Liberator pilot obeyed that order, repeatedly strafing and trying to drop depth charges and bombs, and coming back multiple times when those failed to release. And for all that, understandably, the submarine began to dive, even then slowing down its dive procedure to try and allow the people on its back time to get away. And all this attack managed to do was blow up a bunch of lifeboats and shoot a bunch of civilians. So well done there, he says sarcastically. And then these attacks continued. The B-25s were sent out, found another U-boat that was helping survivors, and decided to attack that as well. So, and in neither case did they actually manage to sink the U-boat. All they managed to do was blow up people ostensibly from their own side. And somehow they got medals for this. Utter travesty. Somewhat understandably, after all this was done, the Kriegsmarine issued an order not to rescue survivors from further ships that their U-boats torpedoed, albeit that even then some of the U-boat captains would continue to disregard that order and render humanitarian assistance. And even as it was, despite those attacks, a number of U-boats, as well as French and and an Italian submarine as well, continued to try and assist and rescue survivors. So when it comes down to the original question, now that you have context of what we're talking about, were the Allies right or wrong? 110%, 100 and however much extra percent you want to add on, completely and utterly in the wrong. From a strategic perspective, it makes absolutely no sense. Apart from anything else, the relatively understandable issuance of the order to U-boats to not rescue survivors cost hundreds, if not thousands, of Allied lives in the future as a result of survivors from torpedoed ships that U-boat captains no longer would assist. And the attack in and of itself, I cannot understand the mentality of someone, even if you think that, as the US captain who ordered the attack from his base later claimed, that he didn't believe that warships could be flying a Red Cross flag. Even if you believed that, your pilot has just told you there are hundreds of innocent people on the back of this U-boat, as well as in the lifeboats. What do you think is going to happen when you start throwing bullets and machine guns around? And then the pilot, I mean, okay, maybe you can make a fractional argument for effectively someone flying a desk remotely making that kind of callous decision, but what kind of pilot, seeing that, then goes and starts bombing and shooting? I don't understand that. War is war, yeah, but this is murder. And it's an incredibly dark chapter in the war that doesn't get a lot of publicity, and you can probably understand why. And to cap it all off, I mean, heck, even if you find yourself attacking, I think when you make your first, second and third attack runs and your bombs and depth charges refuse to release, maybe you should take that as a signal that a higher power is telling you that this is not such a good idea. But just keep going back and going, no, I'm going to blow these people up regardless. Oh, I mean, I know I rag on Admiral Jean-Saul, but I mean, this is a question from the Mers-El-Kebir video, and yeah, I still believe I'm justified in ragging on Admiral Jean-Saul for doing so, for the actions that he took at that incident, but compared to this, Jean-Saul, as I said, in my mind, bears responsibility for what happened to his men at Mers-El-Kebir, but this is a whole order of magnitude beyond it. I just do not understand why this happened at all. And yeah, what can you say? Well, that particular bit of darkness aside, Armando Matos asks, why didn't the British do an attack like Mers-El-Kebir to Tirpitz, i.e. send 3 or 4 battleships to corner her in a fjord and destroy her, or an operation similar to the stealth battleship that HMS Revenge turned into? Well, there were a number of reasons. The main one was the Luftwaffe. Norway, of course, was under German control, and there were quite a lot of Luftwaffe aircraft present there. There was an entire Luftflotte there during the Battle of Britain, and although aircraft had been taken off for other fronts, there was a fairly substantial number of Luftwaffe aircraft still there, and that did include dedicated anti-shipping strike units because, of course, they were attacking the Arctic convoys. So if the Allies had sent a bunch of battleships over to attack the Tirpitz, they would have come under quite heavy attack from German aircraft, both dive and torpedo bombers. Of course, on top of that is the fact that Tirpitz is hostile from the beginning, unlike the French were as the British approached, which means that there would be every possibility that if the Germans in any way, shape or form got wind of the operation, that there would be a bunch of U-boats and such like present off the coast of the fjord, which obviously would complicate matters further. And then beyond that is also the fact that Tirpitz was moored quite deep at the time of her sinking, quite deep into a particular fjord, which means that the Allied battleships couldn't simply arrive off the coast and start lobbing shells randomly at the ship. They would have almost certainly had to proceed down the fjord, at which point they would have emerged at pretty much point-blank range to Tirpitz's guns. And at that kind of, almost for battleship, literal knife-fighting range, there's no battleship that has been built which would be in any way, shape or form capable of resisting Tirpitz's shells at that kind of range, and having to proceed up the fjord would have meant that the battleships almost certainly would have had to sail in line ahead, so their numerical advantage would also not apply for a while until they could all get in there. And so even if the Luftwaffe, the shore defences, the U-boats, and anything else that the Germans had in the vicinity up to and including other naval ships, even assuming that all of that did nothing, the simple fact of the matter is that with no doubt spotters and such on land, Tirpitz would have had every opportunity to ready itself, train its guns on the relevant headland, and probably cripple or blow away the first Allied battleship that came around the corner, at which point all the others are stuck behind it, or will have to very gingerly manoeuvre their way around, at which point they're probably going to be subject to exactly the same fate. The Germans weren't messing around when they came up with the hiding places for the Tirpitz. So, yeah, unfortunately, unlike in the relatively open harbour, at least as far as gunfire is concerned, that Mers-El-Kebir was, Tirpitz was well and truly squirreled away in a relatively unassailable position, at least as far as pure naval attack went. Paul Pomikala asks, during the Age of Sail, were the various navies, British, French, Spanish, American, etc., all using the same caliber guns? To a limited extent, yes, but not in all cases. Now, the other thing to mention at this point is that at the time of the Age of Sail, guns are not so much best described by caliber as they are by shot weight. And this is because well, not to put too fine a point on it, but the fine art of gun making was not quite the absolute precise science it would later become. And guns were rated, as we said, by the shot weight. So if your gun could fire a cannonball that weighed, say, 12 pounds, it was a 12-pounder gun. Now, what caliber is that? Well, it's whatever caliber a roughly spherical lump of iron that weighs 12 pounds is, plus a little bit of extra windage. The reason for the extra windage, one, gun boring technology, as in not uninteresting, but the technology required to actually bore out the gun barrel, again, was not quite as precise as it later would be, so you had to make some allowance for that error. But also the cannonballs themselves would not necessarily always be perfectly spherical, would not necessarily always be made of exactly the same material, and so a 12-pounder cannonball might have slightly varying size depending on the particular cannonball in question. Plus, of course, paint and rust can expand the size. So yeah, there would be an approximate caliber, and you'd allow a little bit of room in there for varying sizes of cannonball plus the wadding, and that would be your gun. Now, with that said, at the lower end of things, 9-pounders, 12-pounders, 18-pounders, 24-pounders, those were pretty much common across all navies. When you got to the upper end of things, however, there were some differences. And obviously, at the time, different nations had slightly different weights and measures sets, but broadly they tended to agree. And with that extra windage, it was possible generally for guns of a certain given weight to be basically interoperable. But at the upper end of things, when you're talking about the primary guns of a ship of the line, there was some variation, with the British preferring, after some experiment with heavier guns, ending up settling on the 32-pounder long gun, and the French and their allies generally settling on the French 36-pounder long gun, as pictured here. And of course, a cannonball that weighs 32 English pounds versus a cannonball that weighs 36 French livres are going to be of different sizes, and hence the caliber is going to be somewhat different. So yeah, as the short answer, as we said, is basically yes. At the lower end of things, guns were broadly interoperable for a given shot weight, but at the upper end of things, there were some relatively major differences. And that's not including the sort of 40-plus pounder guns, as we said, that they experimented with and concluded were not worth it. And lastly, for the video-based questions this week, Primark359 asks, suppose a similar failure had occurred during the Suez Crisis between the US and the combined French and British navies. How would this have turned out? Could the Sixth Fleet stand a chance against the combined Anglo-French forces, given that a French destroyer did fire on an unknown ship during the conflict? Could this have been a possible touchstone? Okay, so this is really pushing the envelope on the period of time that I'll cover, but since we're basing it on a historical incident, and, well, the Suez Crisis is 1956, so it's just outside my normal bracket, but I'll give a broad overview for this particular question. But as I say, this is a broad theoretical, and I'm not going to do this kind of thing very often, if at all, again. So on paper, the approximate order of battle, the combined Anglo-French force would consist of no less than 7 carriers, of which 2 Ocean and Theseus were being used as amphibious assault ships, plus at least 5 cruisers, about 3 dozen plus frigates and destroyers, with a balance being more on the destroyer side of things, and possibly even approaching close to 4 dozen, a number of submarines, as well as the French battleship Jean Bart. And aboard those carriers, you've got around about just under or approaching 2 dozen squadrons. Now, at the time of the incident, October 1956, the US Sixth Fleet, which is the forces the Americans have in the immediate vicinity, as a coherent fighting force, they have an Essex-class carrier, the USS Randolph, a Midway-class carrier, the USS Coral Sea, another Essex-class carrier operating in an anti-submarine role, and therefore not carrying much, if anything, in the way of fighter or strike aircraft, which is the Antium. Then 2 heavy cruisers, the Des Moines-class USS Salem and the Baltimore-class USS Macon, and then a small number of destroyers. There are considerably more Sixth Fleet assets in and around the Mediterranean, but in terms of actually present with the striking power of the Sixth Fleet, there's only a handful of destroyers. Now, there was USS Forrestal on the way, along with a number of other cruisers and destroyers that had been ordered into the area, but at the time of the British-French attack on Egypt, if this had somehow turned into a horrible Mers-El-Kebir scenario and thus a shooting war between Sixth Fleet and the British and French forces, well, the British and French were expecting attacks from the Egyptians, so they were on combat alert, unlike the French at Mers-El-Kebir. And at that point, they actually hold a fairly decisive advantage. Aircraft numbers-wise, they've got an approximate parity, perhaps a slight advantage, and most of the American aircraft, of F-2Hs and FJ-3s, there's not much to write home about in terms of comparison to the Anglo-French forces. They're about equal. I mean, there's a few F9Fs floating around, but not enough to make a tremendous difference. And of course, in terms of actual operational flight decks, if you discount the Antium doing its anti-sub operations and the two of the British carriers that are doing the helicopter landing operations, it means that there are 5 flight decks available to the Anglo-French forces and 2 available to the American forces. Cruiser-wise, you've got 5 light cruisers versus 2 heavies, including 1 Des Moines, but the Anglo-French forces have the Jean Bart, which is something of a major force multiplier. Plus, at that exact moment, there's an awful lot more Anglo-French destroyers present than there are American ones. So if at that particular moment in time things had gone south, the Sixth Fleet doesn't stand a tremendous chance. If they try a straight-up gunfight, they're going to lose because of the sheer numbers of destroyers plus the Jean Bart, and the fact that cruisers outnumber the American cruisers. So yeah, I mean, Jean Bart can easily take on one of the 2 American cruisers and 5 other cruisers versus the remaining cruiser. It's law of numerical superiority. Same with the destroyers. And in terms of the aircraft carriers, the Coral Sea is easily the biggest and meanest carrier out there, but it's rather badly outnumbered. So yeah. I mean, obviously, if Sixth Fleet specifically goes in with the intention of attacking, I suspect they'd rather wait for the Forrestal, the various other destroyer divisions and the other cruisers that are being sent in, plus gathering its other ships from around the Mediterranean, at which point the numbers go completely differently, and the outcome, of course, changes. But yeah, it's basically just that lineup. To be perfectly honest, we can talk about that until the cows come home, but at the end of the day, this is a very experimental period in naval technology. Everybody's got radar-directed fire control and such, and as well as early jets, plus the odd missile here and there. But it's a very untested era of combat, so who knows exactly what could happen. You could have everything from the Salem overwhelming all comers with hails and hails of 8-inch super heavy fire to Jean Bart charging around, blowing everything out of the water with its 15-inch guns by dint of being the only battleship there and proof against almost anything that could be sent in return. Who knows what the radar-directed anti-aircraft guns are going to do to both sides, early jets and late-model prop aircraft. This is basically why I don't really go much beyond 1950. So, on to the Patreon questions. Tuning3434 asks, how would World War I to World War II development of cruisers deviate from the historical designs without the restrictions imposed by the Washington and London treaties? would the later on development of the frigate as a multi-purpose unit happen earlier as a lower cost substitute for cruisers? So perhaps some insight can be gained by looking at some of the designs that were prepared in the early 1920s by various nations, and obviously without treaty restrictions, this being one of them, this being an option that was considered during the development of the Pensacola class, or what would become the Pensacola class, but before treaty restrictions were put in place. And what might be the most notable about it is that it's carrying 12 8-inch guns and 3 triple turrets. So already the escalation was setting in, which is quite remarkable considering that in the early 1920s you were looking at still ships using either single guns or a mixture of single guns and a few twin turrets here and there. And when it came to sort of 7.5, 8-inch guns, not tremendously large numbers of them. And then all of a sudden, within the space of 3 or 4 years, displacements jumped by about 33%, and the number of guns has gotten to a point that wouldn't actually be reached in the treaty era or the immediate period thereafter in the treaty era, except in theoretical designs that were never actually built. So, if we imagine a world in which there are no restrictions on treaties, then I suspect that during the mid to late 1920s, you're probably going to see what we would think of as heavy cruisers in the region of 12 to 15,000 tons, rocking around 12 or so 8-inch guns. And then the escalation is just going to increase from that point forward. So you might begin to see in the later 1920s, because let's face it, arms races always end up in escalation, you might end up seeing something that maybe vaguely resembles a first-generation super dreadnought, i.e. with a Q turret amidships to allow them to bring 15 8-inch guns to the field. I don't think, apart from maybe the French, that anyone would seriously be looking at quad 8-inch turrets at this point. But a Q turret amidships is probably preferable than trying to make a triple 8-inch ship. So, yeah, take that as you will. By the time you get to the late 1920s going into the early 1930s, of course, you do have the Great Depression, which is going to put something of a dampener on everybody building cruisers. But as and when it all picks up again in the mid-1930s, well, you can't really escalate much beyond numbers at that point. More than 15 guns is getting a bit silly, and where honestly you're going to put them. But also at the kind of size and scope you're talking about in the high 10,000 range of 17,000, 19,000 tons, pushing maybe 20,000. One, you're going to be getting a lot fewer ships, but B, at that scale of ship, given that you've blown past the displacement of early battleships and dreadnought battleships and battle cruisers, you're going to start seeing gun size escalate. And if there's no treaty restrictions, I mean, obviously capital ships again at this point are probably going to be rolling around with 16 8-inch and 20-inch guns. So the idea of the largest cruisers beginning to push over 20,000 tons and perhaps being armed with 10, 11 and 12-inch guns is entirely possible, at which point, well, everything else below that is going to get dragged up into things, because, I mean, the 6-inch cruiser is almost dead in the water, except as maybe a flotilla leader for large destroyers. Anything else, it's not going to stand up to a fight against a ship that's armed with dozen plus 8-inch guns, or worse, 9.2, 10, 11, 12, as we said. Assuming that none of this is leading to arms control treaties, you're probably going to end up with slightly less heavily anti-aircraft armed and possibly more torpedo armed versions of something that we might recognise in like a B-65-Alaska- Stalingrad type of arrangement. Not necessarily, and obviously not those classes themselves, because they date from a period a bit later on, but ships of that kind of layout, except perhaps smaller at 20 to 25,000 tons, are going to be very common. And then probably the next logical escalation past that, believe it or not, is probably going to be something along the lines of what historically would turn out to be something like the French Dunkirks or the Scharnhorsts, at which point the battleships themselves are going to be just silly. But this is the nature of arms races. You end up with very, very silly things. And so at the end of the day, there would almost certainly be some form of arms control treaty or sort of levelling out that occurs along those lines, one would hope for anyway. Whether or not frigates would come in as cheap alternatives to cruisers, I don't think so. I think maybe you might end up with a sort of French super destroyer type arrangement, and what we would classify as light cruisers being relegated down a notch to sort of large flotilla leaders, more along the lines of something like a Leander. But that's about all I can think. There probably would be a niche for the sort of 10 to 15,000 ton range ship, but it's not going to be in the line of battle unless somebody decides that perhaps in the mid-1950s that they're going to go with mass numbers, maybe they try and work out some kind of way of mounting, say, 6 heavy guns, maybe 6 9.2 or 10-inch guns on a relatively smaller hull, on the theory they could build maybe 3 of them to match a sort of 20 to 25,000 ton larger vessel, which, because of the necessary speed and armament, is probably going to end up with battlecruiser style armour, which might then theoretically be penetrable by these sort of medium to heavy caliber guns. Bob Kautsky asks, how did the British intercept and, more importantly, decode the orders for General Belgrano, and why did they admit that they were able to do so? As far as the how goes, how they were able to intercept, there were any number of assets. They had a listening post on Ascension Island. Once they'd recaptured it, they had, of course, the signals equipment aboard various Royal Navy ships. They had the Nimrod intelligence aircraft, which were flying around. They also had SAS operatives on the ground in Argentina, and they had the cooperation of the Chileans as well. To the point that one of the Argentinian historians rather suspects the reason that the British didn't bomb the Argentine headquarters in the Falklands was because if they did, it would deprive them of a very useful intelligence source. More to the point, how did they decode them? Well, I suspect that part is probably still classified, and if I did know, which I don't, but if I did and I did disclose it, I rather suspect that would lead to some actual very interesting men in dark coats appearing at my front door in short order. So yeah, the best I can say in terms of how they decode it, I'm going to go with computers and GCHQ, because GCHQ has a truly terrifying level of signals intelligence capability, to the point that even though press reports leaked the fact that the Americans were reading the Argentine codes, which led to the Americans being, by their own admission, locked out of listening into Argentine communications for a while during the conflict, the British were apparently, as far as anyone can tell, still quite happily decoding the Argentine code. So whether they had a man on the inside or whether GCHQ's reputation is more than justified, again, who actually knows? I suspect most of us will be retired by the time that information comes out. As for why they admitted they were able to do so, at the time they didn't. They just sort of went with, well, we knew it was going to do this, that, or the other, without specifically saying that they'd intercepted orders. In terms of admitting it later on, specifically, the Argentinians suspected almost from the start the British could read their codes, but they didn't have confirmation. There's the 30-year rule in Britain, which in the Falklands case expired in 2012, which led to some revelations as to who was able to do what, etc. And there were some leaks and people putting the blocks together before then as well. In terms of general admission, it was like, well, as compared to the days of World War II, where admitting that you could break the enemy's codes could completely reset your efforts if the enemy chose a new encoding system, I rather suspect in the days of computer analysis and such like, although it would be inconvenient, given the informal reputation that the GCHQ has, the enemy having some knowledge that you might be able to decipher their codes probably isn't actually going to slow GCHQ down all that much when you're talking about something like the Falklands War. Say that we don't know that much about them, but what we do know about GCHQ is, well, you thought your message was encrypted. That's cute. There's a reason the CIA and the FBI rather appreciate having the cooperation of GCHQ when it comes to observing people, whether or not they should be on or not. Bob also asks, was Operation Rheinübung a good idea? Did Bismarck and Prince Eugen have a reasonable chance to get into the Atlantic without being intercepted? And what would happen had they managed to do so? Was it a good idea? In and of itself, the idea of raiding British shipping with the German surface fleet, there's precious little else that the German surface fleet can meaningfully do at that point in the war. So, in principle, the idea is good, or at least the lesser of two evils. The alternative being just letting your ships rot, swinging at anchor. But the operation itself, probably not. As I covered in the video on the operation itself, there were a number of political factors behind the operation which led to it being launched when it was launched, which in turn meant that ships like Tirpitz, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were not present, which, well, it did hamper the fleet's combat effectiveness, although that particular scenario, I think we have discussed to death in various questions elsewhere. Did they have a reasonable chance to get into the Atlantic without being intercepted? They almost managed it. In conventional terms, theoretically, yes. But once they'd been spotted by the Swedes and then subsequently been spotted by aerial reconnaissance, both of which they should have realised, albeit they didn't also know they're being tracked by the Norwegian resistance, that should have clued them into the fact the Royal Navy would be able to get assets into the area relatively quickly. Once that had happened, they probably aren't going to be able to get out into the Atlantic without being intercepted, especially with the Royal Navy having radar. If they'd managed to avoid being spotted by the Gotland, the Norwegian resistance, and then subsequently the RAF, then possibly they might have had a reasonable chance. They might still have been spotted by the British cruisers, but possibly the home fleet units wouldn't have got there in time, and they could have gotten out into the Atlantic itself. If they'd managed to do so, well, as I say, they almost certainly would still have been spotted by patrolling British ships, even if they couldn't do much about it. So they would have been intercepted sooner or later. They might well have been able to dunk a couple of convoys, depending on which convoys they intercepted. I mean, Bismarck and Prince Eugen between them can quite handily overwhelm almost any convoy escort that's present in the Atlantic at the time, albeit that Rodney was amongst the ships that was present, so they'd have to be a bit careful. But certainly if they came across a convoy that was escorted by cruisers or destroyers only, or something that was escorted by an old R-class and one of the older Queen Elizabeth, then yes, certainly they could have taken that out. Although obviously with a completely random amount of damage they might have taken in so doing. I suspect in order to live very long they would have had to split up, with obviously Bismarck becoming the priority target. Just what exactly might encounter Bismarck, or how quickly it might turn and head for France when it becomes clear that half the Royal Navy is coming after it, who knows? And also, who knows, obviously, it will probably come under air attack of some description, and what happens then is also kind of up to anyone's guess. I suspect there's still a fairly strong chance Bismarck wouldn't make it back, but in what format that particular chase and kill would have occurred, who knows? And finally, in this episode of the Drydock, Christopher R. asks, I've been reading the book about Midway, Shattered Sword. Excellent book, I do recommend it. It's got me thinking, was there ever a case of B-17 flying fortresses actually hitting a major warship in World War II, specifically at sea, not bombing them when they're stationary in harbour? Whilst the B-17s did hit a number of ships at sea, most of the time these were transports, which obviously moving a bit slower and not as agile, as well as hitting a couple of warships that were stationary whilst out in the open ocean, at least in one case ostensibly because they basically ignored the B-17s because they thought so little of their accuracy. But in terms of major warships, if you don't count U-boats, because a number of U-boats were sunk by B-17s, if you're looking at pure surface ships, about the closest I can find is potentially one hit on a Japanese destroyer that was mobile, and a near miss on a Japanese heavy cruiser. That is about as far as I can determine was the extent of B-17's damaging moving enemy warships out at sea, which, to be honest, is not especially surprising considering you're level bombing from massively high up in the atmosphere. The chances of actually hitting require either random luck or incredible incompetence on the part of the captain below, because, well, as experience in the Mediterranean showed, even when bombers were bombing from significantly lower altitudes, the amount of time present from that kind of high altitude attack means that you can actually spot the bombs coming down and take a degree of evasive action, which is why dive bombing was so much more dangerous to ships. And that brings an end to today's episode of The Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you again in another video.